Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and RPM as a season is just fascinating for a great number of reasons, both on screen and behind it, and we're going to talk about both this time around to really set a solid foundation for this version of the Ranger rewrite. Because unlike most years prior to 2009, where Rangers rolled along as a fairly well-oiled machine poised to easily capture its target demographic and sell plenty of merchandise, RPM came to us on a much different, much rockier foundation. So the year following the writer's strike that still miraculously gave us one of the best seasons to date, Disney made their not-so-hidden disdain for the franchise all the more apparent. As some of us know, Jungle Fury was supposed to be the last season, but contractual mandates that Disney couldn't simply ignore forced the production of what ended up being an even more iconic season among our fandom, and so began the short-lived gazillion era of PR. And in a lot of ways, I think referring to this time period as such is much more apt than simply umbrella-ing the entirety of Rangers from Ninja Storm to RPM as simply the Disney era. Mainly because the variety we got within this window, relative to other notable Ranger timeframes, speaks less to Disney's loose-handed sensibilities regarding the property and more to the creative leanings of whoever happened to be in charge at the time, be it Doug Sloan or Bruce Kalish. That having been said, however, Disney did have a tendency, both in terms of casting culture and in showrunner selection, to call up one of their own. The aforementioned Bruce Kalish notably wrote the famous Jet Jackson, both show and DCOM, before being given the reins to SPD. And Doug Sloan produced DCOMs for Disney Channel before and after his Ninja Storm to Dino Thunder run, including Johnny Tsunami, Motocross, and Minutemen, three of the better films within that specific field. Likewise, Gazillion had been writing for Disney since the late 90s, steadily working for years before creating his claim to fame, American Dragon Jake Long. I won't belabor the point too much more, but the point is that this is how Disney handled the production of Power Rangers. For better or worse, their focus wasn't on having a unifying vision for the franchise so much as it was giving the property to whoever was in-house for seemingly arbitrary stints of time. And with that notable apathy came Eddie G's assurance to his higher-ups that he could turn a franchise he saw as stagnant into something that could appeal to a much wider demographic. And since said higher-ups, again, didn't care one way or the other unless Gazillion started not meeting their unclearly defined standards, spoiler alert, they basically told him to swing for the fences. And he did. Sort of. Gazillion ended up creating one of the most universally beloved seasons of Rangers to date. But no season is flawless. And with RPM being such a captivating ride on a multitude of levels, the ways and means that certain aspects don't quite work are interesting to discuss. As we all know, Eddie was let go about halfway through, leaving Chip Lynn in scramble mode to finish the season. Not exactly an ideal position for either showrunner, but here's the other important thing. By Gazillion's account, the ending he originally planned for, and really everything that he envisioned happening pre-firing, never saw the light of day. Disney reportedly never made that transition of information happen. So, when discussing RPM from the perspective of what could have happened, or what should have been changed or better resolved, that's a clear factor. Now, I of course don't actually have the entirety of Gazillion's vision, nor has anyone truly confirmed the theory that Dylan was meant to be the actual final boss all along. But if I were a betting man, I'd lean towards that rumor. But because of that, it's impossible to say with any degree of certainty where these characters, or this plot, would have ultimately ended up under the stewardship of a singular guiding force. So, with that context now firmly established, let's dig more into the meat of the season itself. Even with the novelty of Corinth as a setting, and everything that means, this season really starts and ends with the characters, so that's what the majority of this rewrite will focus on. Each and every one of them give highlight reel performances and absolutely sell their portrayals, probably none more so than the good doctor herself. So in my mind, the acting quality of most of RPM's major players is beyond reproach in the context of it being a season of Power Rangers, and the fact that Gazillion was adamant about focusing on them first and foremost as the guiding force on screen was probably his best move as a showrunner. However, all that being said, the way the characters are written for is something worth honing in on. To aid in structuring this part of the conversation, I'm going to be focusing a fair bit on the flashback-heavy focus episodes, because they're all built with the intention of providing character depth. However, almost all of them tell us a whole lot, and almost nothing at the exact same time. Allow me to explain. First, by digging into arguably the weakest written main character in Flynn McAllister. Now, I'll never take anything away from Ari Boylan's magical performance here. The dude can flat out act, and with a fairly believable Scottish accent despite not actually being Scottish. But Ranger Blue presents us with some easy inconsistencies right out of the gate, and it gives the impression that Flynn was meant to be an entirely different character before his backstory aired. So, we understand that Flynn's upbringing is very tied to traditional spandex-laden superheroes, and we also know that, despite poor results early in his adulthood, he eventually does vindicate himself and earns his father's approval. But there is this very obvious disconnect here that RPM never really seeks to explain or rectify. Firstly, Flynn is presented in the show to, at times, be this bastion of very black and white principles, even when they make no sense in the context of RPM's setting. But that's also a good thing, in a way, because RPM at its core is a fight where the imperfection of humanity finds a way to win against the supposedly perfect machines. We should be seeing flaws in our characters. But the problem is that all feels kind of fake, and it's never called out for being so. Flynn is presented as wanting to be an all-righteous hero, but doesn't quite understand what that means, because he's far more prone to begrudgingly going about his day and describing himself not as a hero, but as a simple mechanic. So if anything, he's a far more practical, grounded hero who isn't always terribly anxious to leap into the fray. That description fits Ziggy a lot better, but we'll get to him. So the point I'm trying to make is, what was the actual point of Ranger Blue? Adult Flynn got exactly what Child Flynn always wanted. He's exactly the type of superhero that he dreamed about, right down to the colorful suit. But if you take away his flashbacks, then we have no reason to buy into that as ever being his aspiration. He's not actually all that self-sacrificing, or the type that goes out of his way for others as Summer tends to do. As a ranger, and as a character, he's presented as doing what he can, with the practical skills he's acquired. Skills that are presented to us as merely a cursory aspect of his upbringing. Fixing this would honestly be simple. You can go full force and make Flynn the next generation chip he might have at one point been intended to be. Then, allow that sunny side to be crushed by the weight of reality. Conversely, allow his backstory to sensibly progress him from point A to point B. Instead of saving a group of people by driving a bus into a hellscape, maybe he uses his tech wizardry to actually fix the bus. He'd still be a hero in that context, but we would then see the point where the practical application of his skills takes over, since up until that point, his original heroic conceptions had only ever gotten him fired. Because Flynn is a hero, most of the time, but not really for any of the reasons the show wanted to convince us of by way of his character history. That entire setup and resolution is just jarringly inconsistent. Making this relatively easy change wouldn't necessitate changing much else about Flynn too, since his focus episodes almost exclusively hark back to his technical know-how, making his character discrepancies even easier to notice. Following along with our Ranger Color focus episode trend brings us to Summer Lansdowne. Now, Summer, I think, is one of the more consistently great things about RPM, and her on-screen actions sort of speak for themselves. So in this specific case, it's less about her, and more about the details surrounding her. And this is kind of where we see a bit of tension between Gazillion's intention to mature the season, and his need to abide by the sillier, campier Ranger trappings we're used to. All because he didn't want the show to be too dreary. So in the context of this two-parter, we're given the death of the most caring person in Summer's life, juxtaposed against a marriage storyline that just doesn't do anything for anyone involved. But there is a way to write around that too, by instead making the fake marriage a real one. Hear me out on this. That whole saving Scott thing is very clearly symbolic of Summer letting go of her family's not-so-subtle selfishness. But one could argue that Summer got caught up in the moment a bit, so maybe she legitimately regrets just how much distance she put between herself and her family, since a lot of her backstory revolves around how painful it is that they never seem to have time for her, and now she doesn't really have time for them either. So, this chance to potentially reobtain the Lansdowne fortune, while very sleazy and wrong in so many ways, represents Summer's chance to finally be recognized as a quote-unquote real Lansdowne. So instead of this gimmicky setup off the back of the boys joking about how much money they'll be rolling in, which is kind of tonal whiplash off the back of everything Andrews goes through, we have actual moral complications to consider when Summer doesn't automatically say no to marrying for money. But the real oddity of the two-parter that is Ranger Yellow is how it ends. Summer and her parents make amends, but in a super hollow way, since we know that her parents don't actually have a clue what they're talking about when they say they'll get jobs. I mean, let's call it like it is. This episode has much more in common with the Ranger Ribbon than Worlds Apart. This episode didn't need this half-baked resolution. The Lansdowns are dicks. They got rich being dicks, and if the fact that their daughter almost dying in the Corinth wasteland didn't convince them to change their ways, what honestly would? So the way I see this entire backstory playing out is to keep the tone consistent by having the morality of the ask as the focal point. And then, instead of Summer's parents finding jobs or whatever, we later learn that they aren't actually broke, but are simply looking to use Summer to expand their fortune to even greater heights. They only tell her that they're broke because they know their daughter just well enough to predict that she wouldn't even consider the idea otherwise. What Summer assumes will be a shortcut to family acceptance, dubiousness of the request be damned, ends up being the last straw. But importantly, this event doesn't actually change the Lansdowne parents, because they'll just assume that their silly daughter is going through a phase and will be back in their control soon enough, which is probably what they assumed when she started rangering in the first place. Basically, what I'm saying here is that if this show is really meant to be aged up Power Rangers, let's not needlessly soften the clear implications of this incredibly unhealthy parent-daughter relationship. Let's have a bittersweet resolution where we have to deal with the fact that the most upstanding Ranger here almost traded in her principles to resolve a lifetime's worth of negligence. And let's have the grounded realization that sometimes oblivious to the point of obnoxious people don't learn their lesson. And it's already right there for you. They aren't really treating this marriage as a last desperate act to rebuild their high life status quo, which would have been just as viable a way to approach it. They're treating this like a business transaction up until the flimsy finish. This would also build a lot more context around Summer's natural inclination towards helping people, because in this new version, Summer would be given an added layer tucked inside her seemingly do-nothing-wrong outward persona. This focus episode would now function as a telling moment that speaks to her inbuilt need for external affirmation. She helps, not just because she can, but because doing so as a Ranger has so far rewarded her with the kind of admiration she never received in her formative years. And with the family fallout, we can dig into who she really sees in the mirror now that she knows she'll never truly be accepted by her biological family. Has she actually changed all that much? Is she trying to save people like Dylan because she actually believes he's worth saving? Or because she hopes to discover a love she's never known? All questions the remainder of the series would look to address through their developing relationship. So now, let's move on to crowd favorite and Green Ranger extraordinaire, Ziggy Groover. As is the case with Summer, I absolutely adore Ziggy and love the way Milo Cawthorn portrays him. And also similar to Summer as far as this rewrite is concerned, a lot of what could have improved Ziggy as a character involves shoring up some of the tonal dissonance defining the situations he finds himself in. I stress some, because you can't really have Ziggy without that unique dim-witted charm of his that made him one of the stronger characters this season. For example, you could argue that there's a lot of tonal inconsistencies surrounding how the Green Ranger is initially recruited. All of the other Rangers to that point were recruited by very calculated means, and here, smack in the middle of the end of the world, we have a setup akin to auditioning for some sort of high school musical. But this is one of those cases where the lighter tone actually successfully speaks to the characters, because we see the frustration of the others. We understand inherently that for them, this is a waste of time, and they're not sure why they trusted Ziggy at all. Everything that's happening here is perfectly in line with what we expect from our protagonist. And that's because Ziggy's biggest advantage as the ultimate underdog Ranger is that he can change the tone in a very natural way, because he's so often, admittedly, not smart enough to do any different. He tries to do right by people, so his screw-ups end up as comedic fodder by accident many a time. This works fairly well into the plot of RPM, because at worst, it gave the writers an easy out when they did want to try and ease back on the tone. And at best, it allowed Ziggy to serve as both a genuinely entertaining foil to the more serious Rangers, as well as being a much more complete representative of that flawed humans versus perfect machines theme. However, this doesn't work as well as it could have when we arrive at Ranger Green. The cartels in general are the biggest wasted opportunity of the series. Fresno, Bob, and his associates aren't real characters. They only serve to give context to Ziggy's focus episodes, and what's more, the fact that they are literally criminals has little to no bearing on anything, including Ziggy himself. And hey, how fitting would it be if they were somehow connected to the wealth of the Lansdownes? But the point is that if it's going to be a cartel, you can't make these guys softer than Mr. Collins. It just doesn't add up. And then comes the bigger question, one that neither Ranger Green nor any episode ever actually answers. Why is Ziggy in a cartel to begin with? He's very clearly meant to be a screw-up who could only ever harm people on accident. The most cartel-ish thing he ever did was attempt to rob Dylan, and even that was just as farce-filled as most of Ziggy's shining moments. So all that Ranger Green really tells us is that, in the end, Ziggy is a stand-up guy after all. But everything he does after becoming a Ranger, and a little bit before, already tells us that without flashbacks. His morality isn't ever a question mark. But if he's going to be presented as infamous in the criminal underbelly, well, shouldn't it be? Why did he ever want to impress Fresno Bob, or work for him for that matter? So on top of retooling the cartels to be actual cartels, and everything that implies about the structure of power in Corinth, here's the simple story change I'd make to Ziggy. He accidentally took someone's life, which led him to the cartels because Bob offered Ziggy protection in exchange for labor. He's still a screw-up, but for whatever reason, Bob doesn't actually mind that. Let's let that be open to interpretation. So now, we can frame his criminal background as a genuine mistake and, oh look, an easy point of connection for the other romantic pairing. And what's more, we can frame his betrayal of Bob, as well as his can-do attitude towards being a Ranger, as a means of repenting for his crimes. He doesn't know if redemption will ever come his way, if he even deserves it. But, despite his incompetence, despite his weakness, he'll give it his best shot. And really, what more can you ask of anyone? Okay, so wow, that was a lot so far. But we all knew that a rewrite like this would inevitably end up as a massive undertaking. When part 2 hits, we'll discuss the rest of the main characters and a few supporting ones, before broadening our scope a bit to discuss the season as a whole. And until then, thanks for watching.